Okay, boys and girls. So finally, we are going to start the fourth book in the Gregor series, and this one is called Gregor and the Marks of Secret. Okay, so we just ended the third book on Friday. It should be pretty fresh in your memory. Um, Based on Grace's face, I don't know if she listened to it all, and that's okay. You can at any time. They're posted on YouTube. Okay. Um, Hold on here. So we left when, if you remember, when Gregor said to Mrs. Carmacci, the neighbor, "Can you keep a secret?" And so we thought, or you guys kind of shared that you thought he was going to tell her about the Underland. Okay? So let's see what happens. All right, so this is part 1, and it's called The Crown. Chapter 1. Gregor sat on his bed, tracing the scars with his fingertips. There were 2 different kinds. The thin lines crisscrossing his arms had been left by the treacherous vines that had tried to drag him into the Underland jungle. And the deeper marks, the ones made by the mandibles of gigantic ants during a battle, they could be found on most of the rest of his body, although his legs had borne the brunt of the attack. The scars had flattened out a little, but the silvery white color made them far too noticeable for him to wear short sleeves or cut-offs. While none of this mattered when it was cold out and he had had to wear warm clothing, in the 90-plus temperatures of July, it was a real issue. So already we've skipped because it was springish. Remember he said there was like spring breeze and scent in the air when he came back the last time, so now we're in July. He made a face as he took a small stone jar off his windowsill and unscrewed the lid. The fishy smell of the ointment immediately filled the room. It had been prescribed by the Underlander doctors to help diminish the scarring, but he hadn't been very responsible about using it. Hadn't even thought about it much, really, until that day in May when he'd walked out into the living room in shorts and his neighbor, Mrs. Carmacci, had gasped, "Gregor, you can't go outside with your legs showing like that. People will start asking questions." She was right. There were about a zillion things his family couldn't afford, but questions topped the list. As he smeared the gunk from the jar on his legs, Gregor thought longingly of the local basketball court, the wide, grassy lawns in Central Park, and the public swimming pool. At least he could go to the Underland. Knowing that gave him some comfort. How ironic that in the Underland, which had always been a place to dread, had become a place to escape to this summer. Their steamy apartment was crowded with Gregor, his bedridden grandma, his sick dad, and his 2 younger sisters, 8-year-old Lizzie and 3-year-old Boots. And yet there was always the sense that someone was missing. The empty chair at the kitchen table, the unused toothbrush in the holder. Sometimes Gregor would catch himself wandering from room to room, aimlessly looking for something, and then realize he was just hoping to find his mom. She was better off in the Underland in a lot of ways, even if it was miles beneath their apartment and she missed them all so much. The human city of Regalia had doctors and plenty of good food. The temperature was always comfortable. The people down there treated his mom like a queen. If you could get around the fact that the city was always on the brink of war, it wasn't a half-bad vacation spot. Gregor went into the bathroom to scrub his hands with the only thing that seemed to be able to cut through the fish ointment, scouring powder. Then he headed on into the kitchen to get breakfast going. A pleasant surprise awaited him. Mrs. Carmacci was there already, scrambling eggs and pouring juice. A big box of powdered donuts sat on the table. Boots sat in her booster seat with a ring of white sugar around her mouth, munching on a donut. Lizzie was pretending to nibble her eggs. "Hey, what's the special occasion?" asked Gregor. "Lizzie goes to camp," said Boots. "That's right, young lady," said Mrs. Carmacci, "and we're making sure she gets a big breakfast before she goes." "A big breakfast," agreed Boots. She poked a sticky paw into the box of donuts and held one out to Lizzie. I've got one, Boots, said Lizzie. She hadn't even touched her donut. Gregor knew she was probably too nervous to eat, with camp and all. I don't, said Gregor. He caught Boots' wrist and directed the donut towards his mouth and took a huge bite. Boots burst into giggles and insisted on feeding him the whole donut, coating his face in sugar. Gregor's dad came in carrying an empty tray. How's Grandma doing? Gregor asked, carefully watching his dad's hands for signs of the tremors that meant a bad day was ahead. Today they seemed steady, though. Oh, she's doing just fine. You know how she loves a good donut, he said with a smile. He noticed the nearly untouched breakfast on Lizzie's plate. You need to get some of that in your stomach, Lizzie. Big day today. The words tumbled out of Lizzie as if a dam had broken. I don't think I should go. I don't think I should go, Dad. What if something happens here and you need me, or Mom gets sicker, or what if I come back and everybody's gone? Her breathing was short and rapid. Gregor could see she was working herself into a state. That's not going to happen, honey, said his dad, kneeling down and taking her hands. Now listen, everybody here is going to be just fine, and you're going to be just fine at camp too, and your mom's getting better every day. She wants you to go, Liz, said Gregor. She told me to tell you about 20 times. Besides, it's not like you're going to see her and... A look from his dad cut Gregor off. Stupid. What? That was a stupid thing to say. Lizzie had tried again and again to work up the courage to go down to the Underland to see their mom, but she never made it farther than the grate in the laundry room before a full-blown panic attack hit her. She'd end up crouched over a tile by the dryer, gasping for air, trembling and sweating. Everyone knew how badly she wanted to go. She just couldn't. Sorry, I just meant, Gregor stammered, but the damage was done. Lizzie looked devastated. That's only because your sister's the only one in this family with any sense, said Mrs. Carmacci. She straightened Lizzie's braids, although they were neat as a pin. You wouldn't get me down in that Underland for $1 million. Not me. In a moment of desperation last spring, Gregor had decided to confide the bizarre family secret to Mrs. Carmacci. He'd told her the whole story, beginning with his dad's mysterious disappearance 3.5 years ago. He'd talked about chasing Boots through a grate in the laundry room last summer and how the two had fallen miles beneath New York City to a strange, dark world known as the Underland. It was inhabited by giant talking animals, roaches, bats, rats, spiders, and a whole slew of others, and a race of pale-skinned, violet-eyed people who had built a beautiful stone city called Regalia. Some creatures were friends and some were enemies, and often he had trouble telling the difference. He'd been down there 3 times. That first time to rescue his dad, the second to deal with a white rat named the Bane, and just a few months ago to help the warm bloods in the Underland find a cure for a horrible plague. Gregor's mom had gotten the plague, and no one knew when she would be well enough to come home. Finally, he'd told Mrs. Carmacci that there was a string of prophecies that called him a warrior. Not just any warrior, but the one destined to save the Regalians from extinction. And that after a few violent encounters, he had also been designated a rager, which was a term reserved for a handful of particularly deadly fighters. Mrs. Carmacci didn't interrupt once, didn't make any comment. When she was done, she simply said, "Well, that takes the cake." The amazing thing was, she seemed to believe him. Oh, she asked some questions. She insisted on double-checking the story with his dad. For a long time, though, she'd suspected that something very odd was going on with his family. The truth was almost a relief to her. It explained the disappearances, Gregor's scars, and the way Boots went around saying hi to cockroaches. As to the fantastical nature of the Underland, Mrs. Carmacci could accept that. After all, this was a woman who had a sign posted by the mailboxes offering to read your future with tarot cards. Still, that first night when Gregor had taken her down to the laundry room to meet a huge talking bat, even Mrs. Carmacci was a little bit thrown. She exchanged polite chit-chat with the bat, commenting on the weather and such, and when some drier fluff blew over and stuck in the creature's fur, she didn't hesitate to brush it away, saying, "Hold still, you've got lint on your ear." Once the bat was gone, though, Mrs. Carmacci had to sit in the stairwell for a while and catch her breath. "Are you okay, Mrs. Carmacci?" asked Gregor. The last thing he'd wanted to do was give her a heart attack. Or something else by dragging her into all this mess. "Oh, I'm fine, she said, patting his shoulder absent-mindedly. "It's just the whole thing wasn't quite real until I saw that bat, and now it's a little more real than I was counting on." From that moment on, Mrs. Carmacci had made it her business to take care of Gregor's family, and they let her because they needed her help so much. Now she finished arranging Lizzie's braids. "So, your camp clothes are all packed. They'll feed you lunch first thing when you get there. How about I wrap up your donut for the road?" she asked. "No, I'm sorry, I won't eat it," said Lizzie. "I want Gregor to give it to Rip Red." "Okay, Liz," said Gregor. He had an echolocation lesson with the big rat today. While Gregor didn't really like the practice of taking Rip Red Lizzie's food, it was important to her, and it always put the rat in a better mood. Mrs. Carmacci shook her head. "There's a whole world of creatures down there having a hard time. They had the plague, they don't have enough to eat, somebody's attacking them. How come you're giving your donut to some smart alecky rat who's the only one who can take care of himself?" "Because I think he's lonely," said Lizzie softly. Gregor suppressed a sound of exasperation. Leave it to Lizzie to turn that irascible, lethal grouch Rip Red into someone to feel sorry for. "Well, you've got an awful big heart for such a little girl," said Mrs. Carmacci, giving her a squeeze. "Go brush your teeth so you don't miss the bus." Lizzie left the room, happy to escape breakfast. Mrs. Carmacci looked after her and shook her head. "Her, I worry about." "Maybe camp will be good for her," said Gregor. Sure it will," said his dad, but no one really seemed convinced. For better or worse, Lizzie was on the bus 15 minutes later, off to the summer camp for city kids. Gregor had about an hour before he had to leave for his lesson with Rip Red. He sat down with his dad and Mrs. Carmacci to discuss what they called the family business. Down in Regalia, the humans had a museum full of things that had fallen with their unfortunate owners from New York City. This had been going on for several centuries, so there was quite a collection. Because of his family's financial situation, Gregor was granted permission to take anything that might be of value. At first, he had combed through the old wallets and purses and scraped up every bit of money he could find. For a while, this kept them afloat. But Mrs. Carmacci had bigger ideas. "I know this man, Mr. Otts. He buys and sells antiques." She gave Gregor a suitcase and instructed him to fill it up on his next trip. So he did. Some of the items were worthless, but there was a ring with a big red stone that had paid the bills for 2 whole months. Now, the money from the ring was about to run out, so they were in the process of planning their next sale. Everyone agreed it should be an elegant old violin Gregor had found under a saddle at the back of the museum. It was undamaged, still in its case. You could tell just by looking at it that it was worth a bundle. Although Gregor was grateful for the income the items brought in, he did not enjoy his scavenging trips to the museum. Did not enjoy thinking about the wallets, the ring, the violin, the people they had belonged to, and what tragic ends they had met in the Underland. Only a few of the owners would have been rescued and taken to Regalia. The rest would have died from the fall or been hunted down by the rats in the tunnels. So it made him sad, the family business. However, today's trip to the Underland did not require raiding the museum. He planned to see his mom, hang out with his friends, and stay for a nice big dinner. In fact, today should be fun, once he finished his echolocation lesson with Rip Red. "You better get going if you want to meet that rat on time," said Mrs. Carmacci. "Come on, Boots. Want to go see Mama?" asked Gregor. He took a flashlight from one of the coat hooks by the front door and hung it on his belt loop. "Yes," said Boots. "I get my sandals." She ran off excitedly. Unlike Lizzie, Boots was a big fan of the Underland. Mrs. Carmacci offered to escort them down to the laundry room to act as their lookout. First, she made them stop by her apartment for a minute. She opened the fridge and dug out a half-eaten bowl of macaroni salad. Here, she said, you may as well take it down to the rat. Gregor held up Lizzie's donut, which he had wrapped up in a paper napkin. I've got Rip Red covered. What, it's going to break your arm to carry this too? Mrs. Carmacci asked. No, I just don't see any point in giving him a perfectly good bowl of macaroni salad. He can catch his own dinner, said Gregor. I was about to throw it out anyway. I think the mayonnaise is starting to turn bad, but I doubt he'll care, said Mrs. Carmacci. Wait, let me find a paper bag. I don't want that rat licking my bowl. Gregor shook his head. You're worse than Lizzie. She could make her little speech to Lizzie about the donut, but Gregor knew better. Practically every time he went down to the Underland, Mrs. Carmacci made him drag along some dish for Rip Red because it was starting to turn bad. Well, maybe she's right. That rat, what's he got? No real home, no family, he has to fight all the time. You know, everybody needs a little joy in their life. For goodness sake, take him the macaroni salad, said Mrs. Carmacci. Fine, said Gregor. He didn't know why he put up so much resistance to taking Rip Red a snack. Yes, he did. Gregor wasn't good at echolocation, and Rip Red's impatience with his lack of improvement had made him at first insecure and then defiant. He had basically stopped trying to master the fine art of navigating in the dark, and Rip Red knew it. So the echolocation lessons had deteriorated into 2-hour sessions of Rip Red telling him what a weak, lazy loser he was. And the idea of rewarding Rip Red with food drove Gregor crazy. Hey, Grace H., if you need to leave to go to Mrs. Chapman, now's the time, okay? So just click the X and hit leave. Down in the laundry room, Mrs. Carmacci made sure the coast was clear before she gave Gregor the thumbs up. He opened the grate in the wall, gave a whistle, and almost instantly, Nike's head appeared. Boots ran up and stroked the black and white stripes on the bat's face. Greetings, Princess, Nike purred. Greetings, Princess, Boots said back, and then they both laughed. This had only happened about 50 times now, but it still cracked Boots up. Gregor thought Nike laughed mostly because his sister thought it was funny. We are both princesses, Boots exclaimed to Gregor. Yeah, that's still a good one, Boots, he said with a grin. Being the daughter of the Bat Queen, Nike actually was a princess. The cockroaches called Boots Princess because they were nuts about her, but it was really just a nickname. Come on, princesses, or I'll be late. He scooped up Boots and turned to Mrs. Carmacci. So we'll see you tonight? Sure, you kids have a good time. I'll keep an eye on things, she said. Suddenly, Gregor felt bad that he'd made a fuss about the macaroni. How could he argue with Mrs. Carmacci about a silly sack of pasta when she was the only thing holding his family together right now? Okay, thanks a lot, Mrs. Carmacci. She waved at him dismissively. What else have I got to do that's so important? Now you better get going. The ride down the tube through the dark stone tunnels into the brightly lit palace in Regalia was uneventful. But his disagreement with Mrs. Carmacci over feeding Rip Red had put him behind schedule. The minute they landed in the high hall, Gregor had to run to his lesson. There was not even time to pop his head in and see his mom as he sprinted down the steps past the hospital level. Deep in the palace, Gregor removed 4 thick stone bars that secured a heavy door and slipped through it, leaving the door slightly ajar for his return. His feet carried him down multiple sets of stairs. The Regalian Council had reluctantly agreed for his lessons to take place here, where he was theoretically still inside the city limits, but where Rip Red's presence could remain unknown to almost all of the people. The rats and humans had been warring on and off for centuries. Very few humans could deal with the idea of a rat prowling around so close to their home. Rip Red was waiting for Gregor in their usual meeting place, a large circular cave off of a set of stairs. The rat was lounging against a wall, gnawing on some kind of bone. He squinted at Gregor's flashlight when it hit him and gave a snarl. "Get that out of my eyes! How many times do I have to tell you?" Gregor redirected the beam, but didn't bother answering. Even in the shadowy light, he could see Rip Red's nose working. "What's that smell?" he asked. "Lizzie sent you this," Gregor said, and tossed the donut at the rat. Rip Red easily caught it in his mouth and rolled it around, savoring the sweetness. "Lizzie, why is it I never get to spend time with the nice members of your family?" asked Rip Red. "And the bag?" "It's from Mrs. Carmacci," said Gregor. "Ah, la bella Carmacci," sighed Rip Red. "And what does the enchantress of the kitchen send me today?" "See for yourself," said Gregor. He was about to send the macaroni salad sailing after the donut when he heard a scuffling in the adjacent tunnel. The sound startled him. No one was ever down here except him and Rip Red. "I told you to stay put!" Rip Red barked in the direction of the tunnel. There was a slight pause, as if the creature was considering retreat. Then came a sullen reply. "I smelled food." On the word food, the low-pitched voice broke into a squeak. Some more so. I smelled food." Gregor thought of his cousin Rodney, who everyone had teased when he'd become a teenager, and his voice kept cracking between his kid voice and what was to be his man's voice. "Who's that?" asked Gregor. "That's your little friend, the Bane," said Rip Red. "After he maimed his last 2 babysitters, the job fell to me." "The Bane?" said Gregor in surprise. He had not seen the Bane in months. He remembered the soft bundle of white fur that had huddled in his arms in fear. Last December, Gregor had been sent on a mission to kill him, but when he discovered the Bane was only a baby, he simply couldn't do it. He delivered the pup to Rip Red instead. "Can I come in?" the voice said from the tunnel. "Oh, why not?" said Rip Red. "Come on in, and you can personally thank the warrior for saving your life." Gregor turned his flashlight beam to the mouth of the tunnel, expecting a slightly larger version of the rat baby. Instead, he found himself looking up at an 8-foot mountain of white fur.